Well, good afternoon to everyone joining us live for another in a series of events from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, featuring contemporary authors and their books that investigate and explain the world around us. Today's program will focus on CEI Senior Fellow and Vice President for Strategy Iain Murray and his recent best-selling book, The Socialist Temptation. We have a special guest who will do the heavy lifting on the interview today. In just a moment, I'll welcome Kevin Williamson, a Texas-based roving correspondent with National Review and an author in his own right. Kevin's next book is available for pre-order. I believe it's available in October. It's called Big White Ghetto, Dead Broke, Stone Cold Stupid, and High on Rage in the Dank, Woolly Wilds of Real America. Two very quick administrative notes. First, if you'd like to participate in the conversation, please use the Q&A tool found at the bottom of your screen or email us at events@cei.org. And second, we've done more than a dozen of these online events in the past 4 months. We've learned a lot about them and learned from you. At the end of the program, I'll remind you to complete a short survey that's very helpful for our planning. Please remember to fill out the survey. Kevin, I'll be on hand in the background and may add a stray comment or two, but I'll do my best to incorporate questions from the audience and stay out of your way as the journalist doing the interview. Thank you so much for being with CEI once again.
Thanks, Kent. One of the worst things about the age of Zoom is that, like all writers, I am basically an egomaniac, and so everyone sits in front of their bookshelves, and you end up sort of looking and see if any of your books are back there, Always one of those things. Iain, it is good to see you. I'm trying to think when the last time we were actually together. Was that in New Orleans? That gold conference?
I think it was New Orleans, yeah.
Yeah. That was, who knew that a plague was going to be upon the land and we'd be doing everything virtually. So a book about socialism. I wrote one 10 years ago. I didn't think it was necessary at the time. I thought socialism was pretty much dead. Turns out I was wrong about that, but I've been wrong about a lot of things over the years. Before we get started about talking about socialism as such, I'm talking about capitalism for a second. Bill Buckley was always fond of quoting Willy Schlamm's observation that the problem with socialism is socialism, whereas the problem with capitalism is capitalists. And there's a bit in your book that I found really interesting. I guess it's in chapter 34, which is on woke capitalism. And you write, the corporations are engaged in, quote, creating a feedback loop of political action in favor of both the corporations and the consumers' values. I think that's a really interesting insight. Tell me more about that.
Well, it's very appropriate that you should ask that question, Kevin, at a CEI webinar, because this, I think, was one of the fundamental insights of CEI's founder, Fred Smith. He was firmly of the opinion that that corporations should be using their advertising networks to promote liberty. Corporations in Fred's day being very much in favor of freedom and the free market, he felt that they should be using those advertising networks to speak not only to Joe Citizen, to Joe Consumer, as he put it, but also to Joe Citizen. So, because the consumer is also a citizen. So he felt that corporations had this vast power of an advertising network and knew a lot about their consumers, that they could speak directly to their consumers' values and thereby help to promote liberty in the political sphere as well. That's something similar to that is actually happening. Corporations have woken up, if you pardon the pun, to this realization that they can actually use their advertising networks and their relationships, direct relationships, even more direct in these days, of course, than they were in Fred's day. They can use those relationships to promote political values that they and their consumers both hold. Unfortunately, it's not been the values of liberty that are being promoted, rather the values of radical egalitarianism. I think it's important when you look at, there are two sort of corporations that are doing this. The first sort of corporation is one who has a direct connection with their consumer and shares their value, a sort of like a Nike or something like that, which realizes that its consumer base is young, it's concerned, it has high disposable income because it's not that people generally aren't on the property ladder or anything like that. So there's a sort of the feedback loop that I mentioned in the book of reinforcing these values. The other sort of corporation is different, I think. I think activists and in many cases activist employees have realized that they can force their companies or industrial sectors to engage in exactly this sort of communication. I think that's the sort of thing that we're seeing happening with the NFL, where activists and activist athletes are sort of forcing the NFL to do this. It's going to be very interesting to see once the NFL season starts up again, whether this has had the effect of turning off traditional NFL consumers and thereby hurts the NFL where it cares the most, in its pocketbook. That's going to be very interesting to see.
Why have the wrong values ascended in corporate activism instead of the right ones?
Well, as I say, I think it relates a lot to where the consumer base's values lie. I think with a lot of the companies like Nike and so on, their base is very much younger, millennial or Generation Z, and are very concerned about the unfairness and injustices that they see in American society, unlike their corporations that they frequent to share their values. So I think in many cases it's a commercial decision. This is a decision that I say in that chapter is really as old as the hills. Every American car dealer that flies a huge American flag is appealing to the values of its customer base, a patriotic customer base. So this is just a newer application of it, using modern technology, and in these corporations' case, a much bigger consumer base.
Yeah, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I notice in a lot of these situations, there is a really big gap between the stated values and the revealed values of a business. For instance, the New York Times, you can go read a lot of columns every day about inequality and the the awfulness of the 1%, but all the advertisements are for Bergdorf and Tiffany and Mercedes-Benz and companies like that. Not exactly proletarian products. Well, let's get to actual socialism then, and maybe we'll return to some of this corporate activist stuff in a bit because I think it's still relevant. So kind of a three-part question for you here. How much of socialism, as American activists talk about it, is a style and a posture, a kind of a posture of radicalism? How much of it is a style? How much of it is real political substance? And how much of it is the fact that right-wingers like myself spent a generation telling Americans that Western Europe was socialist, and then they go to Copenhagen or Oslo or someplace like that, and it looks pretty nice, and they come back home and say, wow, if that's socialism, I want some of that.
Well, I think there is very definitely a level at which socialism is more style, more of a buzzword than anything else. And I think this is revealed when you start asking socialists what sort of socialism they want to see. What do they mean by socialism? Do they mean Marxism? Do they mean communism? Do they mean revolutionary socialism, as opposed to a socialism that ascends through democratic means? Very often, the answers to these questions change on what seems to be an almost daily basis. When you really pin down the more intellectual members of the socialist community, the so-called the people who tend to describe themselves as democratic socialists, then you begin to get a more useful definition of socialism. Yet this is often in contrast to what the political socialists will say, where Bernie and AOC and the like will always say, "Oh, we just want to be like Sweden," and then you have this phenomenon you describe, whereby people have visited these countries, may have friends in these countries, and they think, "Oh, well, they aren't so bad. If the right wing are calling it socialist and the left wing are calling it socialist, then that must be socialism." And yet, when you actually go to these countries and ask people, is Sweden socialist? Generally speaking, Swedes will say no. They'll say, yes, we have a large welfare state, so in that respect, we're a social democracy. But are we socialist? No, we have a capitalist economy. We have we rejected the government management of the economy in the 1970s and 80s and haven't looked back. We have huge corporations like IKEA. We have the only big tech firm outside the United States in Spotify. We have a dynamic we have a dynamic capitalist economy, and we really need that in order to pay for our welfare state. So there's a dichotomy here between what socialists say that they want, and when you look at the policies that they then are promoting, like the Green New Deal, that's not something that you currently see in Sweden at all. Yes, there are proponents of the Green New Deal like Greta, but she's on strike because Sweden isn't socialist enough and environmentalist enough for her. So when you look at the policies that they are trying to impose, they are not the policies that are in place in places like Sweden.
Yeah. So the substance question: how much real intellectual commitment is there to socialism as such? By which I mean central planning on the left. There's a lot of what seems to me like adhocracy, where we don't really believe in central planning as a sort of general creed, but we want to apply it to the energy industry. We want to apply it to finance, what we used to call the commanding heights of the economy. And that to me is an interesting permutation of what's been going on with this, with sort of Elizabeth Warren's proposals for empowering the government to decide who's on the boards of corporations, that sort of thing. It's the difference between owning the means of production and acting like you own the means of production, which is at a certain point maybe a distinction without a difference, don't you think?
I very much agree. So I mean that. This is something that the Fred and I used to call the difference between honest socialism and dishonest socialism. Honest socialism, you actually own the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and when things go wrong, you know who to blame. It's the government. If, however, you regulate the industry such that they are functionally controlled by the government, they can't innovate the way that they want. They can't take over a company the way they want. They can't really behave in the way that a company would in the free market. When things go wrong because of that micromanaging control by the bureaucrats, there is this level at which the socialist bureaucrat can say, well, that's the fault of the company, it's not our fault. And so it's the company that gets that gets the blame, and the result will be probably even more regulation rather than less.
Yeah, the Warrenism, for lack of a better term, seems to me kind of a gray area, because the proposal that the government will have a permanent say over a certain number of board seats is more than regulation, but maybe slightly less than outright ownership. But it's certainly in a kind of a middle ground between the two of those things. In spite of the kind of cartoon version of libertarianism that you hear from a lot of our friends on our left, I don't know very many libertarian policy thinkers who are seriously just against regulation per se. We have arguments about what level is appropriate, what model of regulation is appropriate. And that's where I think there's a little intellectual base dealing going on there, where these proposals that effect, government control of industries and private firms are put forward as just another kind of regulation, like air quality regulations or worker safety regulations, but I think they're really something else. And on that front, from your first chapter, read a little quotation to you. You write, "Socialism is tempting, seductive, alluring. It comes in many forms and speaks in many different vocabularies. It appeals to people who value fairness, who value freedom, and who value security." So with that in mind, what do you think is the best and most persuasive case for socialism? What's the one that we really have an intellectual duty to answer because it's the most legit?
Well, I try to do this in the book. I try to set out at the beginning of the three middle chapters the most persuasive case I could find for the imposition of socialism, and generally it's because it appeals at that level of values that you just talked about. So, for instance, we know things are wrong with society. We know things are particularly wrong with American society. We know that America is an unfair place. That some people are privileged and other people are not. We realize that this has become systemic, such that a young black man, for instance, has no chance of reaching the American dream. So the American dream is a lie because America is an unfair society. Similarly, when America says it's a free society, this isn't the case. Freedom is restricted for many people. They have no agency. They can't. They just don't have enough money to engage in the capitalist society, and are forever being oppressed by those who do have the money. So freedom is a lie. Similarly, community. America is supposed to be an America of community, and the free market and capitalism are supposed to be fundamental factors in providing that community. All they have done is destroy community. If you look at the destruction of union jobs around the country, that was the main bulwark that Americans had against rapacious capitalistic overlords. Destruction of unions has destroyed American community and has led to this rage and resentment that we see in Middle America, that has led to the election of an outright fascist, they will say, in President Trump. And therefore, we must do something about this. Socialism provides the solution to each of these. It will provide a much fairer society with democratic control of our institutions. It will provide freedom, because you will finally have agency. You will finally have the resources you need. And in the restoration of labor unions, it will finally provide that bulwark against capitalism that is so desperately needed, which will allow American communities to flourish once again. That's, as I see it, the case for socialism.
And how do we answer it?
Well, I think we have to. Yeah, I think we have to tackle it at that level of American values. One of the problems that I think that we in the on the wonkish right have is that we'll talk about history, we'll talk about economics, we'll talk about GDP and unemployment rates and all that sort of thing, and we aren't talking about values. We'll say that African American employment is at the highest level it's ever been, and the socialists will turn around and say, but hundreds of thousands of African Americans young African American men are in jail. There's nothing right about this. So we need to talk about values level and talk about how capitalism, the free enterprise system, free markets, all actually promote these values that socialists say they're concerned about how markets are one of the best vehicles for cooperation between people, about how markets are in many ways have helped break down old color barriers and racial barriers. When you are dealing with somebody in the marketplace, you are tending not to think of them by their ethnic or class group, but you are thinking of them as a producer and consumer. Markets have always been, yes.
A lot of critics would say that's just not true, that you see, for instance, discrimination against African-American job applicants, or in banking, people looking for loans, that sort of thing. So how do we respond to that?
Well, the more specific the case gets, the more difficult it is to respond. And this is one of the ways that socialists will argue, that they will always be able to find the exception that seems to disprove your rule. So at some level, we have to talk about the actual economic effects that result. And then I think what we need to do is to say, yes, markets aren't perfect. There will always be bad things happen. But then you need to compare it with the alternative. What happens under a socialist state? And then you see that far more people tend to be hurt than the few people that are hurt under the market system. This is where I think we need to start talking about the inherent contradictions of socialism. The way, for instance, it claims to be democratic, but all it does is empower a new ruling class of bureaucrats that in the end, thanks to the phenomenon of public choice that we well know about, will fix things for their benefit in a way that sucks away far more from the public trust than the market system does.
Yeah, I think that's another example of the kind of base stealing where, of course, there are abuses in free markets, and redlining is a good example of that. And of course, our friends on the left take that as discrediting capitalism as a whole, whereas say 100 million corpses in the 20th century doesn't somehow discredit socialism. Although the interesting part about that argument to me is that free markets and free market institutions allow bad things to happen because human beings are imperfect. And they don't suddenly become perfect when you make them into bureaucrats and give them political power on top of their self-interest. And I think that's the really useful key insight of public choice that we should probably do more to communicate, which is that people don't cease having self-interest when you put them into a political office or into a bureaucracy or give them a regulatory power. Is there a better way to help people understand that, to communicate that?
I'd just like to go back to one thing you just mentioned, which is that people always seem to forget about the abuses of socialism. I think it's important to realize why this happens. My friend and colleague Christian Niemitz at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London first really twigged this, as far as I can tell. There is an identifiable cycle that happens when a socialist state is set up. Then everybody says, yes, this is it. This is socialism at last. This is the new dawn, the utopia. At long last, the International Brotherhood of Man is with us. Then a few years later, the economic contradictions of socialism start to mean that the wheels come off. And then they turn around and say, well, this can't be the fault of socialism. Socialism is perfect. So therefore, it must be the fault of saboteurs or wreckers or the CIA. I mean, that's where we are with Venezuela at the moment. Any socialist worth of salt will tell you that what's wrong with Venezuela is not socialism, but the economic sanctions and the CIA. And then finally, when it all goes to hell in a handbasket, when the economy is completely collapsed, when there may well be hundreds of thousands dead as well, they turn around and say, well, that wasn't real socialism. There were obvious mistakes that were made, and next time when we install socialism, we will get it right. So socialism is always starting from this sort of blank slate, because they have this level of deniability that the previous mistakes were anything really to do with socialism. They will turn around and say, no, that wasn't real socialism. So we're starting from a blank slate every time we try to argue.
Yeah, you mentioned labor unions several times. And labor unions seem like to me maybe a potential area where there's some room for consensus. I think that in a really robust market economy, labor unions can provide a useful service and perform a useful role. I think you have to be very careful about the legal environment in which this happens, and the current American model of irrevocable monopoly power obviously is not well thought out and is a guarantor of corruption, abuse, and self-dealing and all the rest of it. But do you think that there is a way for us to offer market-based correctives to some of the legitimate complaints that we hear from people on the left? And I think market power is one of those.
I think very much so. I mean, if you believe in freedom of association, you have to believe in the freedom of people to come together within a workplace to talk to management and to try to improve their situation. That's fundamental to freedom of association in my mind. Which is why the early attacks on labor union, the combination acts, and so on, both in the United Kingdom and over here, I think were very misplaced and contributed to the sort of us versus them mentality that grew up amongst labor organizers. Where I think the problem really lies is in the privileges that government grants to labor unions. So, for instance, the fact that you are once you win a union election, you are the exclusive bargaining partner in that with the corporation. Furthermore, because you are the exclusive bargaining partner, you get a claim on all the workers' paychecks to pay some dues to you to do your bargaining. So obviously, there are public choice considerations here as well. The unions, unfortunately, are more about promoting the union's interests than their members, and certainly not the non-members who are nevertheless forced to pay. So I think there are ways we can change this. If, for instance, we move to member-only unions, so that the union has a dues base from people who are willing to pay for it, that gives it the incentive to actually work for the benefit of its members rather than for the benefit of the union bosses or the shop stewards or whoever benefit they're working for at the time. Unions will have to present benefits to their members that make them much more, in my view, legitimate as a bargaining partner with the industry or corporation. So I think there are definitely ways that we can square this circle. Unfortunately, because labor unions have this current position, they are very much dedicated to maintaining this position and even expanding it and getting more power over their members or non-members, especially. Thus, we see the attempts to unionize daycare workers in states around the country simply because they get some money from the government to help them work. The unions are saying, "Oh well, we have a claim on that money because we can represent them." Let's switch it the other way around. That if daycare workers want you to represent them, then they can give you the money. but that's not what the unions are trying to do. They're trying to extract it rather than receive it voluntarily. And so the incentives are just all wrong at the moment.
Yeah, I think the moral attraction of labor unions is the same as the moral attraction of socialism, which is the idea of solidarity. Another philosophy that promises solidarity is nationalism. And you write at some length in the book about the relationship between nationalism and socialism, not just in the context of the National Socialists, who the less said about the better, I suppose, at this point. So this is kind of a two-part question for you. One is I'd like to hear more about the relationship between nationalism and socialism in explicitly socialist countries or in countries with sort of undeniably socialist governments. I'm thinking here of Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba. But also a point you make that's of particular interest to me is that socialism sort of makes a sneaky entry into the right as well through the avenue of nationalism. And you write that even some avowed conservatives espouse socialist policies. This is particularly true of conservatives who identify conservatism with populism or nationalism. Populist conservatives tend to see successful capitalists as at best, or at worst rather, traitors to the national interest, or at least as indifferent to their fellow citizens. They find the purported remedies offered by socialism attractive, even if they don't call themselves socialists. So answer that in either order you like.
Yes, I think it's very important to realize that socialism throughout its history has had this very strong relationship with nationalism. If you look at the Communist Manifesto, for instance, one of the provisions is that emigres, anybody who wants to leave the country, should have all their property confiscated. There's this hostility to the idea that you should have the freedom to go and live wherever you want. No, you must live within the socialist state or suffer penalties. Of course, we know that what this led to in East Germany, all that heartbreaking footage of people desperately trying to get across the border into West Berlin and being shot at and in some cases killed within inches of the border. So socialism has this relationship with nationalism and the national identity that is often disturbing, and it's what leads to that second phenomenon that I mentioned earlier, the phenomenon that when the wheels start to come off, it can't be the fault of the nation. It can't be the fault of good, loyal citizens. It can't be the fault of socialism. It has to be the result of foreign agents. It has to be the result of saboteurs and wreckers and the CEI. So this is, and this again is one of the contradictions of socialism, because socialism claims to be about international brotherhood. One of the great socialist songs is the Internationale. They set up the first, second, third, fourth internationals to try to promote socialism around the world. But in the end, it's always socialism at the nation state level, and that leads to significant problems. It's part of the reason why the socialist economies tend to collapse. Moving on to nationalism and populism on the right, yes. Unfortunately, there is this feeling amongst some nationalists on the right that foreign countries do not trade with us in order to gain mutual benefit. They trade with us in order to exploit us or to destroy our manufacturing base. That somehow trade is an instrument of war. And once you get to the idea of an autarkic populist nationalist country, then you start. That's when the domestic socialist policies start to be applied, because obviously some industries will suffer in an autarkic world. Then there needs to be some sort of industrial support for them, some sort of industrial policy. And that industrial policy tends to go down the roads that socialist policy does, of providing subsidies and mandates and support for industries that otherwise wouldn't survive. So essentially, it turns into the functional equivalent of Soviet tractor production quotas. Industrial policy is by its very nature distortive of markets, and in the end, you have something that's basically functionally equivalent to socialism.
Jonah Goldberg once put it: "There's no difference between a firm that's been nationalized and a firm that's been socialized." I mean, functionally, they amount to the same thing. Back to the question of values, I suppose. And, well, actually, you made me think of something real quick. You're talking about the proposal to confiscate the wealth of immigrants. I hate to keep coming back to the subject of Elizabeth Warren, but I was really struck a while back. She proposed sort of a confiscatory exit tax on people who renounce their American citizenship and become citizens of a different country. The number of people who do this every year is vanishingly small. The last time I checked, it was in the low hundreds in a country of 330 million people. And most of them are people who were immigrants from another country who became US citizens and then decided to return to their home countries and relinquish their US citizenship. It's such a small thing, but it's so important to them that the punishment itself is the goal. Not that the punishment would have any real economic effects, which it wouldn't. It wouldn't raise any revenue for the Treasury. It wouldn't change probably the behavior of any significant number of people. But the desire to punish is something that is really very deeply rooted in people. And I think that socialism speaks really very strongly to the desire to punish. And I say this because if you look at the American example, and we're very wealthy, very free, still, even with all that's going on right now, very prosperous society. And almost all of our conversation about inequality and our conversation about patterns in income and such is focused on wealthy people. It's not focused on poor people. It's focused on the purported sins and abuses and excesses of billionaires and Silicon Valley types and Wall Street types. It's very rarely focused on the actual economic conditions of very poor people, either in rural areas or in the big cities where we tend to have large populations of concentrated poverty in that way. And it's interesting to me because this is so transparently driven by spite and envy and this kind of perverse Puritanism, the idea that somebody out there is having fun and we have to do something about that. And someone's got a yacht and that's just not something we can all live with. What do you think about that?
Well, I think Margaret Thatcher actually spoke to this very well. The democratic socialists of Britain in the 1970s were always going on about the greed of the wealthy, that the wealthy were somehow sinful. She turned it around because she, as exactly as you say, she talked about the politics of envy. Socialism was a politics of envy. So therefore, socialism itself was sinful. So she was communicating at that sort of values level that I think we very much should try to echo that sort of talk. But you're exactly right on this focus on the wealthy as opposed to the focus on the poor. My colleague Ryan Young here at CEI and I together wrote a couple of papers a couple of years ago on when income inequality was the big topic of the left's rhetoric. And we pointed out that absent from all of this rhetoric about income inequality was the simple question, how are the poor actually doing? And we demonstrated in those papers that the poor were doing much better than they had previously, and that the reason for this was a certain set of the institutions of a free economy which really benefit the poor at the same time as they benefit the wealthy.
Yeah, and that kind of actual nuts and bolts analysis, I think maybe in the long term is really one of the more powerful intellectual weapons we have. There's this, this vast accretion of facts that have to be dealt with, and people can ignore them, but I think they still ultimately matter. Where we really have a deficit,
Facts
I suppose.
Are stubborn things.
They are stubborn things.
Yes, facts are stubborn things.
But they're defenseless things. I mean, people can just ignore them. And so I suppose my last question here has to do with the romance deficit. Socialism promises to people a great cause, something that might give your life a sense of purpose and meaning, that you can, change the world, seek justice, and move us a little closer to some sort of utopian settlement. Whereas the alternative to socialism is what we broadly call liberalism. And I speak about this a lot on college campuses, back when you used to be able to speak on college campuses. And when I tell students that the purpose of the state is to protect property, that's what it's there for. This seems like a simple thing, like a banal thing, but it's actually a really tremendously important thing. They don't, seem particularly inspired by that. They want to have a government and a political system and a political confrontation that acts as a channel for their values, for their aspirations, for that sort of thing. Whereas I think ultimately what you and I would prefer to see is a government that is so far in the background that you only notice it when it's really needed, and that good government is like good technology, that if it's working, you never think about it. It's just they're doing what it needs to be done. Now, I don't take a particularly doctrinaire libertarian position on any of this sort of stuff. I'm perfectly happy to have kind of social programs and a Hayekian model, and I think there's actually a lot of things in Western Europe that are done pretty well that we could learn from, even if we can't necessarily emulate them. But that is, for some people, I think, lowball. It's uninspiring. It is not what they want to hear. So is there a way to help people to understand what a tremendous important thing it would be to have a government that simply effectively secures your rights?
Yeah, I think that you're right about the situation, the position of property rights in this debate. They are fundamental to this debate, and yet somehow they are not viewed as important. If you look at the history of property rights, the Romans had a sovereign right of property. Property rights were extremely important in the overthrow of the despotic regimes of Europe. The Virginia Charter talks about a right to property. Rose Wilder Lane said that she'd seen a draft of the Declaration of Independence that referred to life, liberty, and property in the same way that John Locke did, rather than life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm not sure about the veracity of that claim, but it's possible. Property rights are really fundamental to the free societies that grew up in the 18th and 19th centuries. I think in some ways property rights have been a victim of their own success. Property is now so abundant that people begin to think of it as being not terribly important. But when you look at the history of indeed, yes, but when you look at the history of socialism, it's always based on one degree of expropriation or another. At the very least, in the European social democracies, you have tax rates of 50% or more, and so your property is being expropriated that way. Your fungible property is being expropriated. But socialist countries have a history of expropriating tangible property as well. And when you start looking at what this leads to, then you realize that that it's fundamental to the collapse of socialism and to all the deaths that are associated with socialism. The greatest number of deaths from socialism have all come from starvation that have followed the expropriation of land, the collectivization of land and agriculture. So property in its most fundamental sense of the place where you live, the land where you live, that's opened. It's open season for that for socialism, and the gradual chipping away of property rights that we've seen in the United States over the last 50 years ago, with things like the Endangered Species Act and so on, the Waters of the United States rule, telling you that you can't do certain things with your property. Those all chip away at property rights, and in the end, once enough of those have been chipped away, expropriation of the very land that you live in is almost certainly next.
Yeah. I see that Kent has added a book to his bookshelf back there, which pleases me very much. And I understand you also have some questions for us.
I do. Thank you, Kevin. I'd just point out to all of our viewers right here, the smallest minority, Independent Thinking in the Age of Mob Politics. It's a book that I recommend. You can find that author on Amazon and in booksellers near you. But I did, this last conversation that you were having, I sparked a question from Donald, and it echoes a question that I had earlier in our forum here, where you were talking about some of the insights of public choice. And he really wants to hone in on the fault line in the different ways that socialists and liberals think about people, specifically human nature. You know, socialists have a view of human nature that is perfectible, and therefore produce institutions to achieve that end. This is the thinking of Woodrow Wilson or Liz Warren, Kevin, as you've talked about. Whereas liberals tend to go a different direction, more like our founders, or like what we see in contemporary letters with Tom Sowell, that human beings are flawed. And I wonder if you could speak to that human nature question. Is that reconcilable? Can we work with or learn from people that are implementing some socialist ideas if they're starting from a very different foundation of what is the human being?
Shall we start with you, Iain?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that this is where public choice comes into play. You know, the great insights of Buchanan and Tulloch and the rest were that anybody in a position of power has exactly the same motivations and flaws as the rest of us. So we are all flawed. So are the people that socialism puts in a position of power above us. That's how we get to the sort of animal farm situation, where some animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Those powerful pigs have accrued to themselves all the wealth and privileges that Farmer Jones used to have, because of that's nature. Of course, in this case, it's porcine nature rather than human nature, but nevertheless, that's nature. So, when we talk about public choice, we are admitting that that human beings have these problems which lead to the perceived evils of capitalism. But because public choice exists, we have to realize that that there is no such thing as an Olympian god who can be elevated to a position of knowledge above us. You know, this is where Hayek's insight of the use of knowledge in society comes into play. We are flawed, and we don't have enough knowledge to implement a socialist system. So that's, I think, our response there. the idea that man is perfectible is just time and time again it has been disproven, and we just have to make that case.
Yeah, I think that cult is the first word in culture, and a civilization is based on its beliefs. And these questions, I think, are prior to questions of economics or even questions of political organization. You have to figure out what the nature of reality is, what human beings are actually like, before you can make decisions about how do we live together in community, what kind of system of rules is appropriate, what kind of system generating rules is appropriate. And this is where I think there's maybe a kind of intellectual fault line between some conservatives and some libertarians, in that there is a difference in emphasis with people like me believing that there are certain spiritual and moral and philosophical questions that have to be answered before we even get to the questions of economics and political organization.
Okay, well, Kevin, that's actually a leaping off point for the next question that comes in from our audience, from Bill. How we transmit this information, the rulemaking processes, the evaluation processes of a society, because he asks about the role that colleges and universities play in promoting socialism, and the high costs associated with conservative and libertarian intellectuals abandoning the field, leaving the academy to pursue either rewards in the market or working in think tanks and other idea centers, but not actually teaching these fundamentals. So what role do universities have in the circumstance that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, it's not even just people in the kind of market side of things abandoning the academy, but within the academy. You'll meet a lot of people who have kind of roughly our values and our views in economics departments, in law schools. You'll meet a fair number of them in political science departments. You won't meet them in the theater department. You won't meet them mostly in the literature departments and the humanities and things like that. And this is where culture really comes from. Culture is profoundly shaped by the kinds of stories we tell, by how we tell them, and by who tells them. And more than abandoning the universities, I think it's been our abandonment of the cultural institutions and cultural creation itself that has really been a kind of unilateral disarmament.
Yeah, I think Kevin's absolutely right there. I think there are two illustrations of what's going on in the academy that should give us a real pause about just what is happening there. The first is the research of Phil Magnus that from the American Institute of Economic Research that I refer to in Socialist Temptation. He'd actually surveyed all the college syllabuses that are available online, and worked out that the first most prescribed text in academies is the Plato's Republic. Yes, fine. I'm a classicist. I'm not going to complain about that. The second most prescribed text is the Communist Manifesto. And it's not being prescribed in economics classes. It's being prescribed in history classes. It's being prescribed in English classes. It's being prescribed in sociology, in anthropology, in all the classes that have the word studies after them. And and it's being prescribed uncritically. There's no balancing text with it. So we shouldn't be surprised that that young people are feeling more sympathetic to socialism. Another thing was there was a story that came out, I think either yesterday or today, from I think it's Craig State University, where the economics department there has a bunch of courses that teach Marxism uncritically. So an economics professor suggested that there should be a course that actually critiqued Marx, and it's been vetoed time and time again. And he's finally come public saying, look, this is ridiculous. Why is this happening? I think this speaks a lot to what I talk about in the Socialist Temptation about the socialist view of rights. There can only be a right to free speech in the socialist view if it redresses some sort of power imbalance or injustice. So there is no right to defend what they view as a power imbalance or injustice. Thus, there is a right to teach Marxism, but there is no right to critique Marxism, because to do so just keeps that that power imbalance, that injustice in place. And it's that fundamental attitude to rights and to free speech and free inquiry and free thought, which should be at the basis of our academia, which is just being distorted, or you could even say perverted.
I'm going to ask one last question. It's been one that I've been looking forward to. I'm going to ask you each in 60, 90 seconds to address the question, but also incorporate any sort of closing remarks or ideas that you want to share as we wrap up the program. And my question centers on something I read recently from you, Kevin. You were discussing socialism and Iain's book, and I believe it was at National Review, you challenged one of the central tenets that Iain has. I don't want to get through this whole hour without mixing it up at all. And so the question is, for you, what was that challenge around communications and the primacy of it? And Iain, how do you respond to that? And if you could wrap all that together with closing thoughts, we'll move toward the conclusion of our program. But Kevin, you first.
Sure.
What did you see as a deficiency? And Iain, how do you respond to that?
Not so much a deficiency as a difference in emphasis, I suppose. And what I would say is that I think we exaggerate how much of this is a matter of rhetoric. So people very often ask me, how do we more effectively communicate this? How do we more effectively communicate that? And I don't think that our situation is one that we can actually effectively propagandize ourselves out of. Our problem isn't so much in our communication as in the fact that the people who lead our institutions have, in the main, long since ceased believing in their own dogmas. So the universities have been easy to bully out of defending intellectual freedom because the university administrators don't really believe in intellectual freedom. If the business community is not standing up for the value of markets and free enterprise, there's a reason for that too, and it has to do with what they believe. You see the same thing in churches where, eventually you have a clergy that stops believing some aspects of its own dogma is no longer as animated by that, and it becomes more of an institutional inertia question. So I think that there's a question beyond how we talk about things, which is how do we get a more genuine and meaningful change in where we see our values lying and in how we go about living those values in our everyday life, as opposed to a question of how do we make more clever arguments or more persuasive arguments about X, Y, or Z policy points.
Yeah, I actually very much agree with what Kevin's just said. That there is a lack of leadership at the institutional and authority level that we are really suffering from, because we have allowed the long march through the institutions to take place. We now see all the people who should be in the position of defending the liberal order are ceding that to socialists, or actually espousing the socialist arguments themselves. So this actually gets back to what we were talking about right at the beginning, which is those who retain some position of authority or institutional influence need to be using all the channels that they have to stand up for liberty, for the American founding, for the liberal establishment that has brought so much good to this country. It can be as simple as flying that American flag that we talked about, but at a more sophisticated level, it is using those channels to communicate the values of liberty to people. So yes, it's very much a question of leadership. But at the same time, I really do think that we need to be communicating at that level of values, because otherwise I think we're sunk.
Very good. I want to thank you both. This has been engaging. It's been a genuine treat for me to be able to sit back and listen and not have to constantly be thinking ahead to the next question. This program is going to be available later this afternoon for YouTube. Please share that. Let people know about the discussion, the book. You can find Iain's work here at CEI.org. Most of Kevin's work is archived at National Review Online, easy to find online. And final request for all of you, as I promised at the top of the show, there will be a short survey as you log out. I very much appreciate it if you could take that survey. It helps us form the programming going forward and improve the format of these programs throughout the year. So with that, I say thank you, and we will conclude our most recent book forum on the Socialist Temptation.
Thanks, Ken.